of us, but there are great differences in the ability to control our attention. And even in a very bright population like Navy pilots are a hugely select group, but even within that group, I was very surprised that we found substantial improvements in prediction. We were testing a big group of pilots and big group of air traffic controllers during training. The measures of attention control do a much better job of predicting who's going to be successful in being trained to be an air traffic controller than these very long tests that the Navy has used over the years. That it would be possible that if the tests that we've developed were used throughout the Navy, that it could save $50 to $100 million a year, every year, in training costs. And so that program was very, very broad, and it funded people literally across the nation to do this kind of work, and really the brain mechanisms that are involved in that. And I think we've made great progress in understanding that. But I think eliminating this program is going to have a huge impact on this kind of work. You know, you've got an awful lot of particularly young scientists that are early in their career that are doing just great work. And I think when this program is eliminated, it's going to have a big effect.
So we know that trans and gender diverse youth in the US have some of the worst health outcomes compared to any other group of youth. And so what we wanted to do in this project was to create an online mentoring intervention where these youth could come together to reduce negative, deleterious outcomes and promote resiliency and thriving even in the face of adversity. And so that was essentially the project. It was terminated on March 12th. Going to a group of trans and gender diverse youth and saying, sorry, the federal government says that you don't matter anymore, and so therefore you're not getting this intervention. I mean, that's catastrophic. Luckily, through the lawsuit I'm part of, we were able to get it back. It's at risk of going away here any moment. And I think one of my biggest concerns throughout all this is the message that it's sending to trans and gender diverse youth, that essentially they don't matter, there's something wrong with them, which will have catastrophic impacts. It will literally cost lives.
From polls that Americans are really concerned about misinformation. They're interested in how to distinguish between what's true and false online. So we saw after recent disasters, false rumors about FEMA, false rumors about the fires in California, different diseases and vaccinations. This work was being used by journalists, by other practitioners, by county health officials, to help correct false rumors that we know are spreading. And our studies and a bunch of other grants on that topic were canceled and terminated.
We're interested in how people use different types of language to persuade one another and how people do that across the political aisle. Now, practically, this is important because understanding how people use these messages to persuade others could help us understand how political influencers are convincing people to join their causes or to join the party. But also, we could understand a bit more about how this language might be used to bring people together. And we were going to map what's happening in the brain. And so we were really interested in mapping kind of what is happening under the hood when we hear these kinds of messages that people are using. And if we can use that to build an algorithm to predict then how people actually behave towards each other from different political parties using these kinds of messages, I think one of the most important things we won't know is how different messages might be used to influence us. And if we can know things like that more at scale, we can use them for, in what I was hoping for, in the greater good, right? To help understand how messages can bring us together.
So welcome all. Thank you so much for being here for this, I think, sober but really important session. Also, if you're standing in the back, there are plenty of seats up in the front. This is a lovely time to come forward and take a seat. So I'm Lisa Fazio. I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt University. I study how people learn true and false information from the world around them. And as you just saw, I'm one of the many NSF grantees who lost their federal funding this spring. And so before we get started, I want to recap some of the many attacks on science and universities that have happened over the past year. So as of November 12th, over 5,400 NIH grants and about 2,000 NSF grants have been terminated because they, quote, no longer effectuate the program goals or agency priorities. These grants mostly focused on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, misinformation, environmental justice, and LGBT health. We've seen new rules that give political appointees final approval over all federal research grants. We've seen the NSF Graduate Research Fellowship Program make sudden changes just before application season, removing the option for second-year students to apply, and removing clinical psychology as one of the funded areas. We've also seen extreme cuts to the federal science staff, with over 10,000 people fired from the Department of Health and Human Services, and the National Science Foundation losing about a third of their staff. Multiple universities have been directly attacked, with their federal funding being held hostage in exchange for policy changes, changes in leadership, and large fines. A proposed compact would have had universities give up their institutional autonomy and academic freedom in exchange for preferential treatment for federal funding. We've seen international students been threatened with deportation for exercising their First Amendment rights, with one psychology graduate student from Tufts being detained for over 6 weeks. There are also proposed changes to the visa program that would only guarantee graduate student visas for 4 years rather than for the length of the program. And this is a very non-exhaustive list. And while we'll focus on the US context during this session, these threats to science and universities are rising worldwide. So while the US has seen kind of the most sudden, dramatic shift, these are threats that are happening in many countries around the world. And so because of all of that, I'm really excited to be talking here today with our panelists who each have expertise that'll help us understand what's currently going on and what we can do about it as students, as faculty, as members of the Psychonomic Society. So first up, we have Julianne Barron. Julianne is the executive director at FABS, the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences. FABS is a coalition of scientific societies, academic departments, and organizations that works to advance human understanding of the mind, brain, and behavior through advocacy and education to Congress, US federal agencies, the administration, and the broader scientific community. Psychonomics is a longtime FABS member, and we're grateful for all the great work that Julianne and FABS are doing for our community. Next, we have Simon Fisher-Baum. Simon's a longtime psychonome who is associate faculty at Rice, though he's been away from Houston for 3 years and can currently be found in the DC area. We also have Sarah Hellbronner from Baylor College of Medicine. Sarah's on the board of Science Homecoming, a great initiative that encourages scientists to write op-eds about the importance of science funding for their hometown newspapers. And finally, we're joined by Seth Maskett from the University of Denver. Seth is a political scientist whose research focuses on US politics, particularly political parties, campaigns, and elections. All right, so I'm going to take a seat in a second, but we're going to start with just some opening remarks from each panelist to share briefly kind of the work that they do and kind of why they're here today. So we'll start with Julianne. I think they're hot to start.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Thanks so much for the invitation to be here today. It's a real honor and a really important time to be discussing this. I do want to just give a shout out to my FABS board member, Mark Kutanch, who was helped with those videos that you just shared and sort of the critical role he played with one of the many ways we're trying to communicate what's happening in Washington, D.C. I will say not only is Psychonomics a longtime member, they're one of the, I think it was kind of a brainchild of a governing board meeting back in 1979. And the idea was that while the Scientific Society wasn't going to get political because they wanted to, keep the rigor of their science, but they did recognize that there was a very important role that the federal government played in supporting that and making that possible. The funding, the data sets, just so many ways. And so sort of that conversation started in 79, and then my understanding of the history is in 1980, Psychonomics together with 6 or 7 other organizations sort of decided they needed the Reagan had just been elected, and there had been some concerns about the science budgets moving forward. They decided they wanted a permanent presence in Washington, D.C. And it's a 501c3, so it was a permanent presence to make sure that people understood what we talk about when we talk about behavioral and cognitive science. And so a lot has changed since then, but we continue to have that presence. As Lisa did a very nice job of describing, we work both with the administration and with the individual federal agencies, as well as with Congress, and it just sort of depends what's happening in each year and at the time of who we're most engaged with. We have recently doubled in size from 2 to 4, so just to give you a sense, sometimes we have to prioritize a little bit. Just to give an example of the kind of things that we might be involved in, sort of last year in the previous administration, there were a number of kind of calls to action and a very strong demand for our scientists. We had our colleagues from the Department of Justice calling, and how do we get more of those behavioral scientists involved to help us make better decisions in the service to evidence-based policy making? And there were several reports from the President's Council of Advisors in Science and Technology about the way we do searches for federal employees, we use these keywords. How do we change those words to make sure we capture more of the behavioral and cognitive sciences? So we were really kind of getting in the weeds and trying to figure out how to spread behavioral and cognitive science around the federal government. Things are very different this year, as you might imagine. And so we really shifted sort of the type of work that we're doing, and where we were engaging more with the administration and individual federal agencies. Our primary agencies are the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the Institute of Education Sciences. We've really spent a lot more time working with Congress this year. And I think I'll stop there and we'll get more into that afterwards. But again, it's an honor to be here, and thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm filling in, a last-minute fill-in for Betty Toller, who is a longtime program officer at the National Science Foundation, where she runs the PAC program, Perception, Action, and Cognition, often with a rotating program officer who has a different affiliation. I am here as a Rice employee, and I am talking as a Rice employee. That I will be careful in how I answer questions because of that. There has been an enormous amount of turmoil, and I think Lisa did a really remarkable job in describing all sorts of different kinds of changes that are happening to science. And I think the moment that we're in is one that is filled with uncertainty. So even walking around here over the last couple of days, people have come up to ask me about various bits of gossip that they have heard about what's going on in the federal government, some of which to me, feel very dated, some of which happened, some of which didn't happen, but I remember the moments at which that was what was under discussion. And I think uncertainty is the moment that we have to think that we're living in, and how we face that uncertainty. And so the other thing that I've heard a lot of as I've walked around is, when are things going to get back to normal? And I am worried about that as an attitude that we as a community have, because I'm not sure that maybe we will get back to normal, whatever that means. But I think maybe a better way of thinking about it is science had reached a homeostasis, a type of organization in a tractor basin, something, I don't know, I'm trying to throw out as many psychonomic terms as I possibly can, and that was working, and that we learned to optimize for in lots of different ways, and we have been thrown out of that with all of this uncertainty. And we can hope that we will land in another attractor basin, and it may be the same one, but it may be a really different one, and we have to think about what that could look like and how we can be flexible and adaptable as we move forward as a field, so that we can anticipate what that future could look like. And we're not passive agents in this, right? We can do things now to think about what we might want that future to look like. And we can do things now to think about what we're really worried about possibly losing. So I particularly am worried about what a field looks like when it loses a generation of trainees. And so there's changes to the GRFP that happened. That's a part of the concern. The other thing is, when the second tranche of GRFPs were given out last May, there was a Science News article about how the distribution looked extremely different from what the distribution had looked like, and not in a way that was beneficial to the psychological sciences, right? It was these administrative priorities that had been passed on, that you've heard about, that you're supposed to go to the FAQ page and look at, that any program officer may have told you that at some point, that maybe seemed to be deciding what was going to be funded in terms of GRFPs. And I don't know if that's the future for everything. I truly don't. But I think that should have been sort of a scary wake-up call of what the wide variety of possible futures could look like. And so we need to think about how we support trainees. We need to think about how we tell stories about our science. To try to be a little bit more positive, there are things at this moment that are good for this community. There are good science stories that have come out of this community. Science stories are slow to come out, but we can feel ambivalent about AI as individual researchers, but the US government seems to be pretty all in on AI at the moment, and it is also the story of our field that we are critical for the development of that, and that story has been lost. That story has been lost maybe among ourselves, but it certainly has been lost among the way that we talk about sort of where ideas come from. And we can do a better job as a field telling the stories of what we're doing. And we can also do a better job of the field thinking about how the things that we do actually lead to sustaining change. And so there's lots of pathways to sustaining change. There's pathways through policy, but there's also pathways through commercialization and small businesses that are not about making a ton of money, but instead are about how do we actually imagine doing something that can exist on scale without having to keep on asking a government for money. And so I think there's lots of things that we can think about, and I am going to stop talking for now.
Sarah, briefly introduce yourself in Science Homecoming.
Hi, I'm Sarah Heilbrunner. I am an associate professor of neurosurgery and neuroscience at Baylor College of Medicine, but I'm here representing an organization called Science Homecoming. And I'm working primarily with people you might know better as psychologists, Jessica Cantlin at Carnegie Mellon and Steve Piantadosi at UC Berkeley. And our main, if you open up your browser and go to sciencehomecoming.com, you'll be able to sort of follow along with everything I'm talking about. So the main insight that we had is that science is fairly concentrated. Where science happens is fairly concentrated in big cities and college towns, right? But many of us are not from those big cities and college towns. So for example, I live and work in Houston, Texas, which is the country's 4th largest city, but I'm from Palm City, Florida, which according to records has no NIH or NSF funding in the entire congressional district. That's largely because because there aren't any major research universities there. But I still know people there. I still have relationships with people there. I grew up there. And people there read a local newspaper called the Stuart News. And so what we've been trying to do is get articles placed in local newspapers that speak to the community that are about your personal story. So the next part of our approach is to make the process as easy and painless for you as a scientist as possible. I don't know about you, I don't have a ton of free time, and I didn't, going into this, have a lot of knowledge about how to do this. So if you navigate through our website, you'll find the newspapers that are most local to whatever you consider your hometown, and then you'll find draft letters to send to the editors of those papers to ask whether they might be interested in such an article and what format it should appear in. Now, this part, I think, is nerve-wracking for us because this isn't a task that we usually complete, but I will tell you almost universally, these journalists and editors of newspapers are very much on our side. These are people who are pro-science and they love the hometown angle. And so they'll tell you, how long it should be and where in which section it might fit. And so you come back to our website and you'll see a list of draft articles, of outlines for you to work with. And the goal here is for you to make a connection between your personal scientific career and the values and in your hometown. So make some opening statement, something about how you grew up there and how that growing up in this place led to your current scientific career. Say a little bit about your current scientific career and why the research is important, and then get back to why science in general is important to your hometown, and what investing in the American scientific research engine has done for your hometown. And that could be as specific as jobs or as general as cures, right? And then try to give, without being too, we try to be nonpartisan and very positive, but you can give a sense of what will happen if divestment from science occurs. And finally, bring it all back to the values of your hometown. And so then once you're done with that, please send the draft article to us and we can have it looked over by a professional science editor. Everyone is a volunteer. At that point, by following this pipeline, we've published, as of today, 289 articles in hometown newspapers. And the career stages are well represented with early gains by graduate students, 40%, 20% postdocs, and later coming in to round out the rest, 40% faculty. And there's even a few Nobel Prize winners in there. And you might be thinking, nobody reads those newspapers. I don't read those newspapers, right? But that, I think there's a disconnect between the ivory tower that we live in and the public at large. If you add together the subscribers, the weekly subscribers of the New York Times and the Washington Post, that's 13 million weekly subscribers. If you add together all of the ones from these local newspapers, it's 15 million. More than just the numbers, though, of subscribers, it's potentially a very different audience than would be reached by, like, the former head of the NIH writing an op-ed in the New York Times about how important science is, right? It's just a different set of people. And so when I wrote my own article and published it in the Stuart News, my parents posted it on Facebook, expanding its reach. And you know what? There were a lot of people that I saw that I remembered growing up with, and that they remembered that had either, judging from their social media profiles, were either apolitical or maybe right-leaning, that engaged very positively with this. People like science. It's just sometimes hard to see what it is and what it's doing for us and what the whole engine looks like. And when you can bring it back to them and their lives and their hometown and people that they know and people that maybe they trust, it becomes a totally different story. So I really hope, I promise it will be fairly painless. Many of you are on the website right now, and that you'll join us in submitting more articles and trying to get to a larger group of people the importance of the American scientific enterprise. Seth.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me to this. My name is Seth Maskett. I am at the University of Denver, which is 4 miles directly south of here. And if you've not been to Denver before, welcome to our fair city. We're famous this time of year for having either brilliant sun or snow. Today you're catching us in a rare none of the above day. I'm glad to be a part of this. So I'm a political scientist. I study, for the most part, US politics and specifically political parties. I'm very interested in how political parties make decisions. And that can include things like what stances to take, what to have in a platform, which groups of people are in the coalition, which people are not, and most importantly, like who should they nominate for high office and who should they not. And that's been the subject of the last 2 books I've worked on. My last book was about the Democratic Party between 2016 and 2020. So it was about them trying to figure out why they thought Hillary Clinton lost the presidential election to Donald Trump, coming up with some lessons for that, and then making some changes to their party and coming up with Joe Biden as the answer to that problem, and then winning the next election. So I called that learning from loss. I'm right now finishing up the Republican sequel to that book, which is not at all the same story. They had essentially the same set of scenarios. They lost 2020. They had some chances to learn some new lessons, and they chose not to. And that also works, by the way, apparently. So that book is called The Elephants in the Room, and that comes out next spring. A big part of that research, though, is about, I spend a fair amount of time doing interviews and surveys with local Republican leaders all across the country, but I also get into sort of the question of how did we get to this point? Like, how did the Republican Party get to where it is today? What produced, what put Donald Trump back as the head of that party and as the president? Part of that story is a movement over the last 30 plus years that we generally call conservative populism. And there have been versions of populism that have cropped up in this country and elsewhere at different times, but this has been pretty like a steady growth in this movement. It was considered just kind of a fringe group within the Republican Party back in the 1990s and has slowly grown and taken form. I'd be happy to talk about it more later, but one of its features is kind of an outright hostility to things like scientific research, to higher education, and sometimes even to expertise itself. And that usually hasn't taken full control of a party or a country, but today I think we're seeing some of the consequences of that. I'll say I've also been involved to some extent at conversations at my own university and within the broader political science community about essentially kind of pushing back on this moment and trying to save what funding we have, and trying to organize and resist some pressures that are coming against the higher education community. I have had extremely mixed success in that, but it's something that I and a number of others continue to work on.
Thank you all. So as I mentioned in the beginning, there is a lot happening right now. I think many of us kind of lose track of everything that's going on because each day there's some new announcement, some new problem. So one of the things I wanted to ask each of you is kind of, what's one thing that you want to highlight? Julianne's realizing that the question asked for one. As kind of a pressing challenge for universities, higher education, and/or science. I'll let you think. You can. Do you want to?
Sure. Or actually, could I just mention, though, when you asked who reads the local papers, because prior to coming to DC, I worked in the Texas legislature, and it was a while ago, but my member would come in and she'd be waving a letter from the paper saying, we need to do something about this problem. So I think that is a lot of members of Congress and state legislatures. They're like, oh, this is what my constituents are reading and seeing. So I just sort of want to say how valuable I think that what you're doing is, and that I think people really do read it with consequence. Just one. I mean, I think I would echo the uncertainty, but also the fear, because that just pervades everything. It's just so wildly inefficient. That the process of this thing is some of the hatred and how it's motivated. And so it takes so much more time to get good information. And so it's really hard to know how to be productive and and even you said about the rumors and some are true and some are not true, like, it shouldn't be that hard, and then how do you know what's the most productive thing to do? So I was going to ask how much time we had to talk about the challenges, but given one, I just think because that just undermines every positive thing that we're trying to do across so many areas. I could speak specifically about how that plays out, but I think that's what I would say is both the uncertainty, but also the fear. I mean, it's just to get people to talk. It feels unrecognizable to me in some ways as our country.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that. I was talking to one of my friends who's a lawyer who does First Amendment stuff, and she's been talking to people in lots of different sectors, universities, law firms, press, all over the country. And all the fear that we're feeling at universities is less than the fear and silence that's happening in these other places, where journalists, lawyers are really feeling this kind of uncertainty and fear, and it's silencing a lot of people.
It's really hard to answer one. I think trust is another one. So I don't think that as a scientific community we necessarily are to blame for the breaking of trust. I don't think that we have a lot of blame in that at all. But that doesn't mean that trust hasn't been broken and that it's something that has to be rebuilt. And we're sort of used to this sort of sense that people are going to trust that scientists are doing good and that science is good. And that is not currently the state of the world. And what it takes to get back to a state of trust is action on our part, right? So there was a really good science communication panel right before this that I think is part of what it takes to think about how do we rebuild the general public, which there is no general public, individual people's trust in what scientists do and why we do it. And I think we have a lot of work to do there.
Sarah, doesn't have to be the most important thing, just something you'd like to highlight that's going on right now.
Yeah, I would say it's sort of at the intersection of what you both said. I find it very difficult to know what's real and what's not, and how I should respond to it. So for example, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but Science published an article saying that there's a bill that says that anyone who has co-authored with a collaborator from China in the last 5 years won't be able to get NIH and NSF funding. Well, I think that would apply to a lot of us, and is very scary. So is that, but I guess there's usually some sense amongst the policymakers and people who know things of whether that's likely to pass. Is this like a 5-alarm fire, or is this like I don't know. I don't know. It goes into science, and I get scared, and then the next day it's gone, or it's escalated, and I just have no idea. It feels like there's not a place to turn to where I can talk to other scientists and get informed opinions about when should we activate and when should we ignore? And when we activate, what should that be? Because actually, we are willing to do a lot of things. We're just not, at some point, it's more than our day jobs.
What you got?
I mean, one of the main things I've been focused on over the last year is institutions, universities particularly, that's what I've been focusing on, that seem to want to surrender in advance. Which is something I've been really trying to urge institutions, university leaders and others simply not to do. There's a lot of uncertainty in this environment. There's a lot of fear in this environment, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But there tends to be this feeling that if we just sort of keep our heads down, if we give a little bit, if we sort of apologize for ourselves, if we give up this aspect of research or make changes to a survey without anyone telling us to, then the problem will pass over. And I think that honestly just invites worse problems down the road, and has honestly made those attacking the university system, it's made their jobs a lot easier. So it's something I'm trying to work against.
Yeah, and I'm taking moderator's privilege to give mine as well. I think one thing that really concerns me in this moment is the lack of collective action and the need for it, that any one institution, it is in their best interest to just do whatever the government tells them to do, to give in, to comply in advance. But if every institution does that, then we end up with no higher education system and we lose all of our academic freedom and all of the things that we've built up for. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is this collective action problem, and how do you solve for the fact that individually it's better for everyone to just do whatever, get along, put their head down, keep trying to move forward. But if everyone does that, then the system collapses.
Do you mind if I try and give
Yeah.
a name to what Sarah was describing? Because David Brooks back in the spring wrote about that we had lost a normative reality. And I thought, and he was writing about it more in this narrative that everything in the federal government was broken, and that had become true. And he actually cited research that was funded by SBE at NSF and was one of my former presidents when Roxy Silver did this research at the bombing at the Boston Marathon. And she interviewed people who were there and people who were not there, and she interviewed people about their media consumption. And like 2 weeks, shortly after, and then maybe 4 weeks later. And there wasn't, the PTSD symptoms that they were experiencing later had more to do with their media consumption than whether they were there or not. And so David Brooks, when he was citing that, was saying like, oh wow, like what does that mean about what we believe? And not just believe, but like feel in our bodies, you know, and it may or may not. And he likened it, and then he said, and now think about that in terms of how people are responding to this narrative that everything in the federal government is broken. And so that loss of normative reality, that I thought was a super powerful, and really was like, oh gosh, that's what we're up against in terms of a path forward. But
Yeah, thank you. All right, so Seth, help us understand this from a political science point of view. So what makes the actions that the Trump administration is doing different than kind of normal transitions and transfers of power and kind of the normal changes that we see when we go from a Democratic to a Republican administration?
How much time you got?
You got about 5 minutes.
Thanks for that question. So a couple of things I wanted to mention on this. One is just harken back to what I was talking earlier about populism. Populism in this country, just the ideas behind it is just, first of all, there's some idea that there's a shadowy network of elites out there, and they're working against the virtuous people. And of course, it's hard to know like what exactly is an elite, who are the people. For like people on the left, you know, progressive populists, they tend to see elites are like concentrated money. They're the banks, they're billionaires. For conservative populists, they don't want to focus on money so much, so it's more like Hollywood. It's the media, and it's university professors at elite institutions. And they will tend to see such people as they have their own agenda, it's shady, they're working against the rest of us. Trump has stoked this, but he didn't invent this. This goes back a long way. This is essentially the same sort of thing that fueled the Red Scare in the 1950s. When a number of people, including Joseph McCarthy, were raising fears that academics were essentially disloyal. They were not real Americans. They should be distrusted. They should be investigated. Should be run out of the business. So now that ended, fortunately at some point. But this faction, again, it sort of got rekindled in the 1990s. It's been growing within the party over the years. But for most office holders in both parties, they just saw that as something you throw a bone to that movement once in a while, but you don't take them too seriously. You keep those people happy, you make a joke about Harvard once in a while, or you joke about egghead professors and they're silly, putting shrimp on treadmills, and you just mock them for the most part. Talk about a liberal campus bias, people make a stink about that, but it usually doesn't lead to actual changes in policy. The thing is, with Trump, as with many other things, he is never in on the joke, right? He takes it seriously. And he doesn't sort of do the pantomime part. He just says, oh, this is who we're against, let's just go in and do that. And he kind of rushes in. And as with a lot of other things, he pushes a lot of, breaks a lot of boundaries, breaks a lot of norms, sometimes breaks the law. People within his party, for the most part, do not constrain him. They don't push back, and at least while the other party is out of power, there's not a ton of limits on him except in the courts. He's also staffed himself in this White House with people who share this vision, share a hatred of liberal university elites. I think, as it happens, his timing was excellent. This was at a time when universities were already under a lot of attack in the shadow of the Israel-Gaza conflict. Republicans that have been very successful nationally in making universities look out of touch. This gave Trump sort of the additional weapon of claiming that he was, protecting Israel, protecting Jews by going after universities. So, you have a number of things. In some ways, this is a very old movement, but it really has, kind of a new champion here with a lot of energy behind it right now.
Thank you. And Julianne, you've spent a lot of time in DC. You've been doing policy work, advocacy work for a long time. What's different now from kind of earlier administrations?
Yeah, I mean, everything. It's, the typos that come out, the hallucinations in reports, the federal government, part of the reputation of being bureaucratic and slow is because there's lots of processes in place to protect, and a lot of them are just broken. They're very intentionally. A lot of them are still very much working. I see Simon maybe tilting his head a lot. A lot of it is very much broken in that way, but you have you mentioned all the staffing changes. The executive orders are enormously problematic. Some of them are illegal. So many are tied up in court. Some of them aren't, grammatically correct. You know what I mean? So it's just like, that is very different. There's always been policies I've disagreed with, or things that, I wouldn't do it that way, or I'm not sure that's best for science. But like the blatant sort of disregard for process, or, that's just totally different and so much harder to navigate.
Yeah, so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about kind of what is FABS doing in this moment, which I know it's an overwhelming moment to try and be doing anything, but what are some of the things that you guys have been able to kind of keep going in this crazy time?
Sure. So one thing I'm very proud of that we did back in the spring when those 5 Fridays where everybody was hearing about the NSF grant terminations is that we hired an attorney not to give legal advice but legal information, because one of the many irksome things in the notice that went out was that there was no process for appeal. And also not a lot of clarity on how they could recoup whatever funding they were entitled to. And we did a webinar, and the appeals process, to us, it was sort of a form of protest. Like, we were really concerned that if everybody was like, oh, okay, I guess we can't, then that was sort of saying, like, we're accepting this new land where, things are poorly thought through and sort of done with a sledgehammer. And so we had, I think it was over 2,000 people on that webinar, and then we did a number of office hours where we helped people both recoup what they were able to, and also if they were thinking of an appeal, and then we developed templates of how you can communicate this. Like, not in a, I'm so mad at you way, but in a, I just want you to understand the science that's lost, like very much like the theme of that video, and just encouraging people to articulate it and not assuming that people knew. So that was something we had never done before, but something new and different. The other thing that we decided very early on was that our strongest hope was probably in the Senate, because we weren't getting a lot of traction and there wasn't a lot of dialogue with the administration, even though in the past we have had very open doors and communication, and that the federal agencies were in such a position, again, the rifts, the fear, and we looked to the Senate and we picked 6 senators in red states in leadership positions with committees, with authorizations of authorization and appropriating committees, and the key agencies that we work with that I mentioned. And then we tried to build networks in the districts, because what we saw, and I'd be curious what you thought, was, if change was going to come, it wasn't going to come from Washington, D.C., and that as long as these individual senators were more afraid of their reelection, or more afraid of this administration than their reelection, it would be hard to get them on the record to say things. And I will say that many of them are doing more things behind the scenes than you might see. So we started building networks, doing training sessions, sending ideas for thank you, sending ideas, scripts of how to talk about your science. And so that's really different than what we were doing in the past. I mean, we always brought scientists to DC and we always sort of met, but sort of looking to sort of shift who the speakers were, that was something pretty different. And I feel pretty good about it. I mean, we've had situations where members have said, oh, we had this this meeting, and then the senator sends out a tweet that sort of tracks with this, specifically about vaccine use it. And so we get those stories, and we're sort of building on those. So those are some examples. I did want to mention the legislation you're referring to is the SAFE Act, I think, and that's also, it's just nuts to sort of punish somebody for something they did in the past before, that they didn't know. I would like to believe it will not pass. And I think that there's, and I'll use this as an opportunity, there's a lot of theatrics that's very different than the actual conversations that we're having in these Senate offices and House offices. I tell the story about a researcher I brought from Indiana, and she was like, do I have to go see that member? Because, everything he says I sort of don't agree with. And then we went in, and I was like, yes, you do. We have to have this conversation. They have to understand sort of how it helps you and your institution and your community. And we had this great conversation with a staffer who was thoughtful and had done her homework and was very supportive of science. And we walked out, and the researcher turned to me, and she's like, how can both things be true? How can he say those things, in the media, and then this be the person who's working in his office, And I think there's a number of things there that happen, right? I think it's, she preps the member, and the member agrees and is pro-science and thinks about it, but then the member gets in front of a microphone and is like, oh, but I see I have an opportunity to sort of say something politically provocative, right? And then the media is covering it, and they're like, oh, that's more interesting to write about than I'm being deliberate here about what I'm saying about science. And so I guess that's one, when we get to what we can do about it, one of the things to keep in mind is sometimes the theatrics isn't at all a reflection of the good conversations that you can have in those offices.
So I have a follow-up question for that, because you have so much more information and knowledge, and some of it is, like you said, more tone and secret and or whatever, but knowing everything that you know, and also knowing that not all of us live in DC and there's not going to be time for every one of us to march into the senators' offices. What is one thing that you wish individual scientists would do more of?
Thank you for that question. Just tell their story and speak to anybody who will listen to them. I mean, it isn't just their members of Congress. But there was a poll recently I saw in the National Journal, and I think I wrote the numbers down, but it asked how many people knew somebody who was affected by government cuts back in April, and did I write it down? The number in March was 29%, and then the number in September was 46% of people who knew somebody who had been impacted by federal cuts. This was before the shutdown, right? So I think that number must be much higher. I will say there were far fewer Republicans who knew people who had been affected than Democrats, but we just need to tell that story and help people understand and connect the dots. And so I was presenting to some graduate students, and I asked, does anybody work in a lab that's federally funded? And they were like, oh, I don't know the answer to that question. And are your advisors people who have benefited from federal grants? I don't really know. So I think that we need to trace that and show all of those connections and the foundational work. NSF is really hard to see sometimes, because NSF funds this incredible work that goes on to lots of other federal agencies, and you can see those applications. So, I often say, sometimes fighting isn't the way to win, and sometimes it's just sort of helping people understand in a way, that helps seize the value of the science, but also rigorous science, which people still say they want. It takes training and expertise and time, and is expensive. And that's a lot of why I do the work that I do, because I think that's so critical to the better outcomes. But you cannot assume people are asking that question. When we went up into the Hill, people were like, oh, it'll pass by, or oh, I didn't realize, and they're very reactive. And so we just, my audience is the Hill, but I think it helps for all of the best is third-party validators. Instead of just scientists saying science is important. So if you have collaborators in schools or collaborators in hospitals, we just all have to be talking about it all the time. That's sort of what I think is critical.
Yeah, so just, I mean, I think there's lots of audiences, and I think Julianne hit a lot of them. I think an underappreciated one is our scientific colleagues, particularly for psychologists. So I don't think that we do a great job of conveying what we do to other parts of campus, and I don't think that they always believe that what we do is valuable and important. And in terms of collective action, I would like to see a future where all scientists work together to say that science is important, even this stuff that I don't understand, and I worry that we're not going to get there. And then the other thing I will say is, I have often in conversations where people want to be consumers of the things that we produce or are capable of producing, and sometimes they can name that we do that, and sometimes they just describe things like, man, I wish people could build computational models of how humans work so I could put them in with my engineered systems, and we could be like, wait, we have like a whole bunch of meetings where we sit around and do that. And so there are audiences that are open to it, and I think it's gonna take, I think that's another audience when we're sitting around telling our stories, is to be able to really talk about what it is that cognitive psychology does, what we know, what our skills are, what we don't know, and how we can help other people solve problems. Find like a campus friend to talk about what is possible together, because that's what's gonna make science really land.
Thank you. So we're focusing mostly on the US context, but in Psychonomics we have many, many international members, some of whom managed to come today, many who stayed home. Why is this relevant to them? And I'll open this to anyone who wants to answer, but like, why should people outside the US be concerned about what's happening here?
So I have a couple of answers. So one is there's some really specific mechanisms that we have that allow for international collaboration, right? So there's ways to fund things with the UK, there's ways to fund things with Switzerland, and like as US science funding gets cut, then we're going to see less of that get funded. But I think the bigger answer is that the US is the major investor in science and technology funding around the world. There's no country that comes even close to what we do, and nobody is going to step up to fund the gap of what happens when US funding goes away. And if anything, countries around the world are reacting with similar cuts because they don't want to be put in a position of carrying, carrying the load of what's being lost. So, you know, Canada might be seeing some federal funding cuts going forward. I think, you know, the New Zealand cut their social sciences funding. I mean, so this pattern is happening around the world, and we're not independent of each other. We're like an interconnected world, and so as the U.S. Divests from some of this relationship that we've built between universities and the federal government, we're going to see following happening across the world and not covering.
I mean, there's just very specific things that have changed, like at NIH, and there's significant limitations on partnering with international collaborators, and so a lot of those contracts have been, which I think was sort of progress, having more international interaction, but just cut, you know, so they can no longer, and a lot of these limitations of who you're allowed to work with and sort of being punished if you have international collaborations. I mean, I think we were seeing efficiencies and sort of, I mean, to me that was progress in terms of the more international nature of the science, and there's just, there's like money's not going to international scientists, and as you mentioned, just what I hear from all of our scientific societies is that like international attendance is way down. I mean, again, people are like afraid to come to our country, you know, I mean, that's pretty.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked about the problem and trying to lay out what's actually happening. I want to turn to kind of what we can do about it. So what are some things that our members, the society as a whole, what can we be doing here to make some progress? You want to start out, Sal?
Yeah, thanks. So I want to echo what some folks here already talked about. One of the things I think is really important to do is publicize your work. You know, and I really like the initiative you were describing, just helping people, you know, describe their work in op-eds and get it into local newspapers, which is great. You know, people, I mean, you know, again, there's not a ton of local newspapers left, but the ones that still exist, they're read by people who vote. And so that is useful. But also, like, there's other ways to get your stories out there. You might blog. If you don't, you probably know someone who does and has a following. That could be the same with just like posting stuff on social media, just talking to people about it. People don't have a great sense of what research is being done out there, and it's really good to just be able to explain it to them in a couple of sentences. They like to be able to hold on to that. Similarly, I think it's important to talk to university leaders about it. When a dean or a provost or a chancellor is going around talking to donors or prospective students or things like that, they want to be able to talk about the interesting new research that's being done at their school. It's great for them to have those stories in their ears. So I'd say to get that information to them. Similarly, I think it's important to be pushing those university leaders to do things like collaborate with other schools when it comes to like trying to push back against attacks on higher ed rather than just going it alone. For the most part, this makes university leaders really uncomfortable. They do not like to be seen as political agents. And on top of that, they have people constantly whispering in their ears, boards of trustees, major donors, and others telling them, don't make waves. It's important for them to at least have some other voices telling them other things. So that is all useful. And I would say just in general, what Lisa was saying before is like this, do not attempt this alone. We need to be working together, and that includes people at organizations and professional societies, as well as just kind of cross-university alliances. And I know there's been some efforts to build that within the Ivies and a few other places, where we really need to see more of that.
I obviously, have already told you what I think you should do. You should go to sciencehomecoming.com and write an article. But I want to talk about something else, which came up earlier, which is fear. I know personally this is playing a really, really big role for me. And maybe I'm the only one here at a medical school, I don't know. But what it means is that when my federal funding is threatened, my personal salary is threatened and the salaries of my lab members, right? And then when your salary is threatened in the United States, your entire job is threatened and your health insurance, right? And basically your ability to survive in this country is threatened. And I don't know that in addition, I'll talk to, colleagues outside of academia and they're like, yeah, but I could get fired at any time. And I'm like, yeah, but then you'll go to a different company or even maybe shift gears a little bit. But our whole field seems to be imploding. And so there's not going to be anywhere for all of us to go. And I hope I'm not introducing new anxieties here. I hope I'm verbalizing what everyone is thinking. And what I'm experiencing is very little support from my university, even emotional support, much less material support. But where I do get support is from my colleagues, right? Is from other people who are going through the same thing. And I guess I wonder, in addition to reaching out, I wonder if there's a way that we can help each other navigate this extremely fearful time with the understanding that this is not an exaggeration, right? Like, if I don't have a job, I don't have a house, I don't have health insurance, my kids don't have food, right? Same thing for all my lab members. Like, these are quite dire straits that these cuts can put us in. And I think that this isn't me, wanting to have like a bigger empire and not getting it, right? This is all of our livelihoods, and acknowledging that. And being able to hopefully support. I don't know what that looks like. I don't know what supporting each other through that looks like, either as a society or as a field. But I wanted to throw that out there because I think it's a big part of what's driving my decision making, and I think others as well.
To talk a little bit more specifically about cognitive psychology and the psychonomics community, I think our science is extremely valuable, and we haven't always effectively told the story of the value of our science or figured out how to translate the insights that we get into real, scalable, societal level solutions to important problems that we actually have the knowledge to be able to solve. And I think a thing that we could really do to help ourselves out right now is to be able to build those pathways stronger. And so not to change the basic curiosity-driven science that we do, which I think is important, right? People are also fascinated by trying to understand what it means to be human, because it's fascinating. It's as fascinating as space to try to understand what it means to be human. But we promise that curiosity-driven science has the potential to translate into really important outcomes, but we don't always follow through on that. We might even make discoveries that we say things like, this will be really important for education. But do we talk to the people who are the consumers of the next stage of that knowledge? We don't have to build the pathways ourselves. We cannot do it ourselves. We have to work with other people, but we have to be thinking about who is the consumer of the knowledge that is being talked about at this conference that's not in the room right now, and how do I communicate to them what it is that I know, while also being honest about all the factors that I do not know about that make my idea maybe not necessarily translate. And there are people here who do that fantastically well. I'm gonna, Jeremy, because he got to be sad about being in a med school when Sarah said that, I'm gonna call out Jeremy Wolf's work, which of course is, started from a lot of basic research on visual attention and attentional search, and is now doing really important translational work in thinking about radiology and how we take insights from cognitive science and turn it into medical practice. And that's because, if I remember the story correctly, Jeremy, you were hanging out with somebody from your synagogue who was a radiologist and was like, oh man, I would like to know what you know about. And so we all, these connections happen serendipitously, but we have to pursue them, and we really have to think about the people who we want to communicate our science to, because that is going to build a much stronger basis for articulating why it's really important to continue to support the stuff that we do, both at the federal level, but also at the university level.
So those of you who are at the session with my FABS president, Jeffrey Sachs, just before this, he shared a menu, I believe, in his presentation. And so we created a menu, which is small dishes and jumbo platters and all the things that you can do that isn't live on our website yet, but it will be soon. And it connects to resources like the Science Homecoming. A couple things in addition to what I was saying before about having all those conversations. One, I encourage people to thank a federal colleague, so thank you, Simon, because I feel like these are terrible times, and they are there, and others. They are holding the place together right now, and they are afraid for their jobs, like you were saying. I mean, they're watching what's happening, and I kind of get choked up when I think about it. These are people who have devoted their lives to make the world a better place, and they are getting punished for it. And so we just need to say thank you, even if we're frustrated with them sometimes, because it's not their fault. So I really hope that they'll stay in those roles as long as they can, because what's the alternative? And then this advice is often not very well received, but when you look at the National Institutes of Health, they now have 12 leadership positions that are open. They have pushed out different institute directors. The Center for Scientific Review, no director right now, right? And see, so I say this both knowing that it's a terrible thing to suggest, but also hoping that somebody good will apply for those positions, and will continue to serve in these roles, because again, when I think about the alternative of people not stepping up to do it and who might get assigned, it makes me really nervous. I think that this administration has really been testing the limits of our institutions, and that's a big piece of it. But some of the other things I would say, and actually, if you are in a more stable position and there is something you can do to sort of support science broadly, please do that. And again, this is also not always well received, but our federal colleagues need us to continue to submit proposals and grants. And even if that seems really discouraging right now, and even if you have to sort of twist and turn a little bit because it turns out that what you were studying was illegal and you didn't know it, and I'm kind of joking, but we just have to keep doing that, because if all of a sudden the proposals drop and there aren't the good the great science, that's a great reason for Congress to be like, well, maybe they didn't need all that money after all, or maybe they found other funders. And so we just have to keep doing the science.
Can I add one thing? So also review, because in the absence of an expert set of reviews to evaluate the quality of the science that comes in, who knows how decisions are going to get made.
Definitely. Yeah, so you'll see our menu, and it's not exhaustive, but there's lots of different types of things to do that we're suggesting. And we do provide a lot of trainings, and we actually are starting some office hours. So if people want some hand-holding for while they're doing it, I think it's 12 o'clock on December 12th is the first one, and then we'll do it every other week, probably not between the holidays, but stay tuned for that as well.
Thanks. And I'm wondering specifically for the students in the audience and those who are in more precarious positions, what are some actions that they can take?
So I mentioned the small business program. So I actually think as we think about how to do scalable solutions, and as we think about how to maintain positions for trainees through these really complicated times, it's not a terrible time to think about what it would be like to take some of the insights that are coming from our labs and entrust a senior graduate student or a postdoc with what it would mean to try to start a company to do that. And there, even though the SBIR funding still has to be reauthorized, I don't know where you think that that's going to go, but I feel like that's sort of in line with administrative priorities. And so that's probably going to happen. And in fact, we think, there's many people in your universities that are already doing this, right? But we think of that as mostly being like what people who build gadgets do. But there's actually a bunch of programs at the NSF that are for our kinds of technologies, which aren't silicon technologies, but are carbon technologies. They're technologies about humans. So there's a learning and cognition program. There is a human computer interaction program. And there are people to talk to who could talk about what it would mean to be able to take an idea that you have in the lab and turn it into something that might actually be a scalable solution. And I actually think, as a very specific thing, that is a potential patch for some of the people who are really worried about what it would look like to stay in this field. And it will also accomplish some of our goals that we want of having the work that we do be scalable and valuable.
Students have really powerful voices actually up on the Hill. We usually have 2 undergraduate interns at FABS, and we bring them up to the meetings. And in some recent meetings when they were talking about how they had been planning to go to graduate school, but now they're rethinking it, like literally an aide sort of led a tear, and she's like, this is what we're doing. We are killing the pathways, and in a powerful Senate office. And so, I think just, again, sort of one, saying the impact it's having on you and sort of your career and how we're losing a generation of scientists and sort of helping people understand that, I think is an enormously powerful. Many of the legislative aides up there are not too long out of graduate school, or not too long out of undergraduate, sorry. And so they're kind of similar in age, and so having a peer talk to them about it, and they remember the uncertainty of knowing what to do and how they should make those decisions, but also just find out how the federal investment in science has actually already supported you in ways that maybe aren't so visible, in ways that you can talk about. I think that's helpful for people to understand as well. So.
Thank you. All right, so as we begin to get close to wrapping up, I want to raise the mood a little bit. So briefly, kind of what's a moment of recent success or hope or something, some action you've seen that's keeping you going? Whoever wants to go first.
Well,
go for it, Seth.
So I was attending, there was some sort of rally for science at the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville. I don't know if you were there. This is back in February or March. And it was clearly a lot of scientists' first time doing anything political. And they had these tiny little 8-point font signs, and they didn't really know how to speak. And they were like, "What do we want? Peer review. When? 6 to 8 weeks." It was. And it was adorable, but they clearly were new to this. And if you attended the No Kings rallies and stuff like that, they've learned. There's some development going on there, and it was kind of interesting to see.
Along those lines, I love that when I go to the rallies, there's a critical mass of my colleagues that I can text a day before, and I know some percentage of them will be there, and then we plan to meet up, and so that we're a little group of Baylor College of Medicine neuroscientists, which is pretty specific to have a whole group that always meets up.
So I think there have been wins. So a bunch of us are Texas-based or used to work in the Texas legislature, and it is the case that in the state of Texas, whose politics maybe align pretty well with the current administration as like a state legislature, just, they voted for a $3 billion fund for brain health research, and then that got overwhelmingly adopted by the people of Texas in a ballot in November. And I think there's things like that that are going on across the country. So that gave me hope because it suggests that this isn't a unified vision about what the future of science looks like, but there's the same people that I might have thought were sort of opposed to science funding have decided to give a whole lot of money, and also like money for the kinds of stuff that we know about and that we can help with. There's lots of people in this room who will benefit from that specifically because they're already in Texas. There's lots of people in this room who could benefit from that if they were in Texas. And so there's that. And then I also think that our arguments tend to land, our stories about what our science is able to do end up landing. So, I mean, we can roll our eyes a little bit at the AI story, but I think that has a lot of legs for being able to articulate why what it is that we know how to do has helped lead us to the moment that we're in an AI, but also can lead us past the moment that we're in AI, and maybe the insights that we have about, sometimes I say that or some of us say that we're speed running the 80s a little bit, watching the AI stuff unfold over time, and that's an inside joke for this room of people who, like, some of whom lived through that. And as a result, we can anticipate what the next set of problems are that are going to come up, and also which solutions maybe are going to work and which ones aren't. And if we can talk about that at scale, then I think that actually provides a really protective bit of demonstration of why what we do is really important.
So I tend to think of myself as a relentless optimist, even despite a lot of, evidence to the contrary of how I should feel. But I think if you think back to when the administration, the president, offered up his budget back in the March, I guess it was, and what those numbers were for the federal scientific agencies, the House and Senate have just rejected them. Like, that is just not what they are even talking about right now. And so if you look at, and the Senate is trying to move forward with their budgets. And so, instead of 50% cuts to the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, I mean, the Department of Ed, sort of a different story, but they have flat funding in the Senate, and that's the bill that's moving and that we're likely to see. And the House is sort of floundering, and so those numbers we're likely to see. And not only will we see flat funding, which, flat is the new up in this situation, but there's a ton of really important report language in the reports that come along with the bills and the budgets. Maintain the NIH structure until you have a deliberative process for reorganizing the National Institutes of Health. Maintain GRFPs. I mean, it's a limit on multi-year funding, which was a tool that this Office of Management and Budget wanted to use to reduce the number of grants. I mean, so there's, like dozens of pieces of report language that we can really hold on to. And even if it doesn't get all the way through, it's there in black and white from a Republican Senate office. And so I think that is really important to remember, again, sort of separating out the theatrics from the deep in the weeds stuff that nobody else reads, but the report language that we work on. I will say that I was super curious when Susan Menares was taking that role at CDC. She was somebody who had been deputy director at the Advanced Research Projects Agency in Health, but she was standing up for that. And I think we all sort of watched as she was, a month after the Senate confirmed her in that role to be the director, she was fired. But instead of that kind of happening quietly, she communicated with senators, and they brought her up on the Hill to have a conversation. And all of the senators expressed concern about what was happening there. And I think she did us all a tremendous service to be able to have that conversation publicly and maybe provide some cover for people who are willing, to step into these roles during these times. So I thought that was hopeful too, and I'm grateful to her for that. And I will say that we are definitely, the conversations are changing on the Hill from when they were, as I mentioned before, sort of like, oh, well, let's give it time. Oh, well, it's probably not so bad. Oh, it's just talk. It doesn't really meaningful. They know now, and they know that we know that they know. You know what I mean? And so it's sort of a different situation, and I think that we are seeing that in some ways. And I think some of the recent current events are sort of forcing that as well. And so I feel hopeful that the people in some of those offices, even if they're not doing nearly as much as they should be and wanting to, are providing oversight in their own way. Like back in August, Senator Katie Britt led a letter with 14 Republican members that said, National Institutes of Health, you spend that money. And that was against many, many efforts to stop them from spending the money. You know, they even they just fired swaths of people who actually got the money out, you know what I mean? And so, but they did, both NSF is my understanding, and NIH, they had to use some tools and tricks and stuff, but they got the 25 money out, and I find that very hopeful as well. So I do think there's things, they don't cover as much, but I think there are things that we can hold on to and keep pushing for. I mean, I just have
Thank you. All right, so I want to turn it over to the audience for questions and comments, but first, a deep thank you to each of our panelists for their So there are mics in the aisles. Please, if you go up to a mic, please identify yourself first, and then try and keep comments brief so that we can hear from everyone.
I'm short. Hi, my name is Molly. I am speaking as a student, not an employee, nor as a recipient of federal funding. I am at Texas A&M. Yes, you may feel bad for me. I want to talk about the talking to administrators comment. I serve as the president of the graduate student org for my department, and I serve as a senator of the graduate and professional student government. And the efforts we put forth to bump elbows with administrators and ask them to please do something, we get the generic responses. And I recognize the complexity of their role. But I'm wondering if you have ideas for how to emphasize that they are allowed to make policy suggestions, or, you know, like they're allowed to say no sometimes. How do we, especially in a trainee context, how do we encourage them to do that in the most diplomatic way?
Do you have that? I'll say a few things. One, your voice is important, even if it feels like they're just ignoring you and the reports are going into the void. Like, the fact that it's on the record and that you're saying it still matters, and it matters that they know that the students are dissatisfied, and it matters that they know that there is pushback. So I think one thing is keeping in mind that even if you don't see kind of outside evidence that you're getting through, it still matters that they're hearing your voice, in addition, as we were talking to the donors, to the legislators, to every other voice that's there. I think thinking about what their goals are and like what they're trying to push for is always a good thing, and how can you align what you're talking about with that? So if they're concerned about their reputation, how will the actions they're taking or not taking affect the reputation of the university?
We try to spin it in the money context a lot.
Yeah, that's great.
The research is on the backs of the grad students, right?
Just to briefly add to that, one thing that I've seen a few other people trying to do, first of all, thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
But occasionally you will find covered in Inside Higher Ed or a newspaper, a university leader somewhere standing up, pushing back, saying this is unacceptable and this is what we need to defend. Forward those stories to your campus leadership. Say, oh, here's an idea. Here's ways you might want to think about speaking. You know, just have that out there. They probably know it, but maybe not. And it wouldn't be bad to have one other voice saying that.
Thank you all very much.
All right, we'll go over this way.
Thank you so much for being on this panel and everything that you're doing. My name is Jessica Marsh, and the timing of my comment is going to be interesting after this. I serve in an associate dean role at my university, and specifically I oversee interdisciplinary programs like women, gender, sexuality studies, Africana studies, Latin American, Latino studies. And this is a bit more of a comment, but I've been trying to think a lot about this, that faculty in those areas and faculty in humanities are feeling like their actual identities are under threat. They feel unsafe doing the work they're doing. They feel unsafe teaching the classes they teach. And I'm sitting in a meeting being like, well, I had a grant canceled, and that's not great, but what I'm starting to see on campus that I'm really worried about is a division between the moneymakers on campus, so the sciences, and the humanities. And the humanities faculty saying, you only care if we have a grant. And I'm just trying to think if maybe psychologists and the social sciences in general have some pivot point that we can use to like help in what's going on, because there seems to be some clashes of natural scientists saying, hey, humanities people, stop rabble rousing. We don't want to lose our money. And like, will be, regardless of what happens, so bad for academia moving forward if we just splinter more on our own campuses. So I'm trying to think creatively and optimistically. Is there anything from as psychologists that we think we could do along those lines? And thank you.
I mean, I would say first, in the absence of federal money, the humanities faculty are the ones that are making money on campus because their salaries are lower and they have higher class enrollments and they teach more. And so that calculus is wrong. I'm not sure that that's going to help solve the problem, but I think it's useful to make sure that that's clear. I was trying to allude to that a little bit by saying that we have to like articulate to each other the value of what we do. And so, I mean, I think psychology is in a good position to tie across that divide, right? So we can articulate what's valuable about what we do to the natural science and engineering folks. We can also like find really clear ties with lots of humanities, and maybe we can help, as a result, build collaborations and bridges so that we all see not just the humanity in each other, but the value that we all bring to addressing the kinds of problems that universities have. That might be really optimistic. I've been away from a university for a while, so I don't know what the dynamics are, but that's my hope.
Hi there. My name is Laura Moret. I'm at the University of Missouri, and that last part will be relevant to my question. So Missouri is a very red state. Columbia is one of the blue dots in Missouri, with the others being Kansas City and St. Louis. What I struggle with, that I would like your input on, is I really struggle, I hear all the time that like we should be contacting our representatives, contacting our senators, but like I look at who these people are and like what their views are, and I'm like, how do I even like get through to these people? And I struggle, I'll just add that like I also struggle with this in my personal life because I have family members who are Trumpers. So I'm just wondering like what, for those of us, I know a few of you are faculty in like red states, what can we do to like have the most impact?
So my understanding as a faculty member in a red state is that you're not gonna, most of the time I don't get someone on the phone. I either leave a message or in John Cornyn's case, its voicemail is always full. And so, but my understanding is that these things are tallied. So you're not trying to convince the person on the other end. They are just like making marks in boxes about what constituents care about. And that's what I'll say about making the calls. As far as convincing people, I'm sure a psychologist has more to say.
I don't have anything to say about convincing people. I'm not that kind of psychologist. But I think that you might have more in common with some of the people who are conservative representatives than you might think. So I've been a little bit surprised in Texas. So the part of Houston that I live in is quite liberal, but just outside of Texas, there's a congressman who's the co-chair of the Neuroscience Caucus, which I didn't even know existed. And he cares a lot about neuroscience. He has a degree in neuroscience, and he wants to talk about things that matter to him, like traumatic brain injury and things like that. And so I think that once we get around political affiliation and we start to talk about the specific issues that matter to us and the kind of work that we're doing, it's much easier to make a connection between what you care about and what some of those other people care about.
The offices absolutely tally. They keep those numbers. And it's not so much that a senator will say, well, what do I think about this? I'll look at my tally. But they'll be like, how much trouble am I going to get in with my constituents? You know what I mean? If I say something they don't want. Or when they're doing their priorities, they'll be like, well, what are my constituents saying? So they keep those numbers. So that does matter to some degree. And I would totally agree. And we have lots of resources for you, and we will be having office hours so we can talk to you directly about it. But I was in Senator Schmidt's office not too long ago, and he has a son with a form of epilepsy. And we were talking about the Brain Initiative, and so that was an entry point. Like, he sees himself as a champion for the Brain Initiative. And then we were like, oh, but did you realize the Brain Initiative has like 10 institutes and centers across NIH, so you really don't want to mess with NIH, if you know what I mean? And so we use that as an entryway. And so I do think, and we look at LinkedIn and we see, like, can we come up with a personal connection so that we can sort of start that? And we always start, like, what's a shared goal? I mean, a lot of the members, I know this is hard to hear sometimes, but a lot of the members, they go up there and they have legislative priorities that are good things. You know what I mean? And so if you can start with that shared goal, it does really change the conversation. And again, sometimes fighting's not the way to win, instead of like, I hate all these things that you're doing, but if you go in and you're like, I notice you're on this caucus, or I notice you have an interest. And then they care about their constituents, because that's what's gonna get them reelected or not. And you can say, I just want to make sure you understand what's happening in your state, how this federal funding has been helpful to me and to my institution and any third-party validator, or any sort of practitioners, depending on the type of the work that you do. But there's all sorts of ways to kind of find enough common ground to have an entry. And then, when they sort of hear this narrative that's not at all true about how science works, they'll be like, oh, we had that nice conversation with that person who seemed very reasonable. Maybe we'll actually ask a question instead of being like, yeah, NIH is bad. You know what I mean? And so, like, it's sort of, I wish that they were asking questions. I wish they had people on their staff who had more knowledge about it, but they may or may not. And so I just really feel like, again, I kind of always go back to, well, what does it look like if we don't do this work? Then they might not know. So.
Can I add to that? One thing I would just add, I would agree with the others, do make those phone calls. And you're going to lose a lot, by the way. But there's a difference. You're probably in the minority in your district. There's a difference between a passionate minority and a silent minority. And that matters to the member of Congress. It matters to the staffers. If you can call when you get a machine, if you can call again and see until you get someone that picks up and just say, this is what I feel, those tallies are worthwhile. They're worth reporting. I would also encourage you, these are mostly federal issues we're talking about, but you're probably not going to get a meeting with a member of Congress. You might with someone in your state legislature. Or a county supervisor or a city council member. And, they can't fix this, but it's good to be on their radar. And that just sort of generates a lot of governmental conversations that I think it's better doing that than not, even if we're going to lose most of the time.
Thank you so much.
Middle.
Hello, I'm Tori from Stony Brook. I have a lot of questions, but I should probably pick one. The first one I wanted to ask is about the concept of reinstilling trust. I think you all kind of touched on it a little bit, like, for example, reaching out to local newspapers and sharing your stories, but I was wondering if there's any other way that we could rebuild trust amongst the general public for the scientific community, thinking about, for example, maybe having an undergrad in your lab in charge of science communication and maybe sharing on social media or something. Do you have any other tangible examples of things that we can do, especially early career researchers and stuff we can do to kind of rebuild that trust?
I'll let someone else chime in with some specifics on like what we can do, but before we do that, I want to mention that trust in science and scientists is actually relatively high right now. So we've seen over the past few decades just a decrease of trust in all sorts of institutions, just kind of nationwide. And like science is doing pretty well compared to other things, which I think is shocking given all of the attacks that we've seen. So there's definitely more we can do, and we definitely need to rebuild some of these, but also we're not in as bad of a spot as you might think.
That's hopeful, thank you. So other aspects of psychology have taken on more of a community-based participatory research model, which involves really building trust at the initial point of doing research by working with community organizations to do research on questions that matter to those organizations. And I think cognitive psychology has been behind other aspects of psychology in doing that. And I think having really strong community partners that can advocate on your behalf and who are helpful in sort of designing the science that you're doing as you start to do it is actually a time-tested way of building trust in the kind of science that we're doing.
All right, thank you. Left.
Hi, I'm Rachel Ostrand. I'm from IBM. So I wanted to follow up on some things that mostly Simon was saying, but kind of connecting to all of you. So one thing that Simon kept saying was how it's really important to take research that we do and actually connect it to something else, right? Connect it to an educational outcome, or connect it to, you know, building a technology or starting a small business or something. And I agree, I think that's great. But I'm also wondering, what do you think about the value of teaching people sort of storytelling and salesmanship, right? Which is not necessarily the same as saying, I did this research and let me actually plug it into education, but rather, let me tell a story, let me give this sales pitch about how it's, excuse me, relevant to education. And this is something I actually have a lot of experience with because I'm the one weird cognitive scientist here who, you know, works at a tech company. And so I've spent basically my whole career working with a bunch of computer scientists who don't care about the brain and don't care about behavior, and trying to convince them that actually they really need to care about, you know, language production, human behavior, when they're like building their next AI widget. And so is that something that you've thought about at all? Like, you know, maybe having classes to teach people this salesmanship, teach people, you know, teach us students, faculty, you know, how do you like spin this story of your research just so it sounds relevant, which it is, but convince other people that it sounds relevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we, like, to accomplish the goal that I set out, which is we need to figure out who is the person that's the consumer of the knowledge that I'm creating and how do I communicate to them what that knowledge is, requires a different kind of graduate education than at least I received. And I think it's probably not something that most of us know how to do. That's why we largely haven't done it, though there are examples of people who are quite good at it. And so, yeah, I think that we need to invest in thinking, you know, some of the time, some of our students' time, some of our own time in thinking about how do we actually discover who the right audience is, what their needs are, how our work connects to the actual experiences that they're having, and the problems that they know they have and are trying to solve, and then us being able to communicate to them. So I 100% agree that we need to figure out how to put that into how we train people and ourselves.
I just want to add to that, and something I probably should have said to the last questioner as well, is that a lot of our universities offer media training. And it's very worthwhile taking advantage of that. And part of that is like knowing how to speak well publicly and, you know, use like, you know, relatively short sentences and things like that, but also like to be able to translate academic findings into something that sounds interesting to lay people. I think it's a really important skill. And I honestly like the idea of making that just a regular part of graduate education.
And can I just add, you are not the only person who graduated with a cognitive psychology degree who ended up in industry. You're just the one that still comes to psychonomics, and I'm really thankful for that. But like, the PIs here know that we are training the workforce for these tech companies, and maybe we need to think about what that means, because maybe these are the skills that we want them to go off to those jobs with so that they can be more effective in altering those workplaces and bringing our knowledge base to those problems.
I will say on our website, fabs.org, there is sort of reaching a broader audience, and where we point to a lot of groups that do a really good job in this. One that comes to mind is the Scholar Strategy Network, and they have sort of university-based chapters, but they have lots of resources for talking, writing op-eds and talking to policymakers, talking to broader audiences. But there are people who are kind of not only doing this well, but studying it. And I meant to mention, too, there's something called the Golden Goose Award in Washington, D.C., and that's a big event that happens at the Library of Congress each year. And they do a fabulous job. It's very, professionally done. But they have a video, and they have bipartisan members of Congress, and it's a play on the Golden Fleece Award, which Senator Proxmire had made fun of silly-sounding research maybe even this room's on the treadmill, but this is saying, oh, some science that people didn't understand but turned into real world applications. And so I will tell you proudly that FABS nominated Jay McClelland last year, and he was featured for the work that he did in cognitive science that led to AI. So who can argue that that's something that we didn't need or don't use, But anyway, so Golden Goose, and it's fun, and they're very clever and, like I said, well polished. Just in case people aren't familiar with it.
Thank you.
Hi. Scott Frondorf, University of Pittsburgh. So you've talked a lot about different opportunities and avenues for science outreach and science advocacy. But one thing that kind of worries me personally is like backlash effects. So I worry that if I was to advocate more for science, that for some people that might actually create a backlash where now they're increasingly, it makes them more hostile to science, either because they didn't really like science anyway, and now somebody is kind of loudly arguing for it, and I don't want to get them to I don't want to be pushed around by that person, so I'm going to double down and be, I really don't want to be persuaded by them, so I'm going to double down and be in my anti-science views. Or somebody just didn't have an opinion on like science funding previously, but now I see this person out there who's not like me and they're arguing for science funding, and so now I've been polarized into opposing science because I saw this other person arguing for it. I mean, and it seems like those backlash effects can be ubiquitous, especially in political issues, and so I'm wondering, what can we do to avoid that kind of backlash to science advocacy, me as an individual or collectively?
Honestly, I think that's the genius of Science Homecoming, which is you pointed out that people, like as psychologists, we know if somebody thinks this person is not like me, then maybe they're going to react. But the point of Science Homecoming is this is a person who grew up in my community and who I know, and so that's the idea behind it. It's a super smart idea.
I think we're also and Lisa said this earlier, we're in a better position than we think. Polling on this is, people do like scientists. It's different than, I don't know, than what you see on the news, because they somehow, they definitely don't think that we're the same as Fauci, right? And a lot of people do like Fauci anyway. But I think that there's not actually, there are some people that are strongly anti a particular type of science, but it's probably not your type of science. And so I think that there's not as much negativity out there as we believe there is, and maybe more, there's just not an understanding of what these threats are and what the impact would be.
I'll add that I guess it depends like how you're describing the work. I mean, I think there's ways that people can just say, you must listen to the science or you're stupid. And like, yeah, that's going to invite a pushback. And I would never recommend talking that way. But like, if you're talking about like a specific finding, and like, here's the thing we didn't expect to find, we found this, here's ways it's helped people. That's not the kind of thing that's really going to generate that much of a pushback. The worst that'll happen is that someone will just ignore you. And so I think it is worth framing things in those contexts. I mean, no one here really, like, we didn't invent napalm or asbestos in this room or something like that. Like, we mostly have things that are pretty positive, so it's worth focusing on that.
Knowing your specific work, Scott, people are pretty pro their kids learning to read. If you frame it that way, then people are going to be into it.
That's what I was going to say is I rarely advocate for science for the sake of science, but in the service to the outcomes and the potential that it serves. And so I come at it a little bit more sideways. Like I'm trying to get to them to support the science, you know what I mean? But coming at it a little bit more sideways. The other thing I think a lot about is something I feel like I learned in parenting is to create some gracious exits. You know what I mean? Like don't create the situation, I think back to like arguing about the broccoli, like they might not eat the broccoli and then I've lost, you know what I mean? And so you don't set it up in that way. You set it up more, you know what I mean? You sort of think it through ahead of time, I think, in what can we both agree on? How do we get there? You know what I mean? And sort of go on that journey together. Oh, it happens to be science that we need, you know what I mean? Instead of sort of have it be adversarial.
And I'll just add something I've learned from my political science colleagues, which is lots of people just aren't that ideological. There's this large proportion of the US population that is pretty apolitical. They want their lives to be better, they want their kids to do well, but they're not strongly tied to the policy positions of one party or another. And so there's lots of people who you can talk to who just haven't thought about this issue before, haven't thought about the importance of science funding. And so we know that opinions are the most malleable from psychological science. Opinions are the most malleable before they've really been formed and solidified. And so you can catch all of these people who just haven't really thought about this issue before, and you can be the one to frame how they think about it and how they'll move forward.
Okay, I'm Dan Levine from the University of Texas at Arlington, and I'd like to comment a bit on that comment about going back to normal versus possible new bases of attraction. And I do think that there are some things about the scientific community, including the psychological scientific community, that need to be tweaked a little bit. I'd like to see, I mean, NSF has done some things which are not likely to bring immediate payoffs, but some of the big social problems, we need more time to develop them. It's like a company that's thinking too much about quarterly earnings and not so much about the long-term human welfare. So we need more of that and more kind of interdisciplinary work. My work I started out in mathematics. I got interested in neural network modeling, which got me into psychology. And I'd like to see neural networks more. I mean, people talk a lot about the AI applications, but there's also the applications to making humans more empathic and cooperative and making society better. And as people are challenging competitive capitalism in general, there should be more challenge of competitive capitalism within the scientific community.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
I don't disagree with anything that you have said. I mean, I think that when I say that we need to think about what the impact of our work is going to look like, it doesn't need to be the immediate impact of our work, right? We need to think about what is the future that we're trying to build towards, and how do we build towards it? Who are the people that we need to be talking to with what we know so that we can move towards that path? And I think that the NSF broader impact criteria can be described in that way as well. I'm not supposed to be talking to the NSF person. My reading as a Rice faculty member of the NSF review criteria.
Hi, so first, thank you for this panel. I think it's been really interesting. I really appreciated this. So yeah, I'm Michael Cohen. I'm a postdoc at University of Chicago currently. So I was curious, I mean, you just talked a little bit about the international piece. So my reading, I mean, which I think is more pessimistic than most maybe, and I think the panel has given me some reason for optimism, where the last year or so has given me not that much reason for optimism. But I still kind of feel like I don't see, I mean, I think maybe in 4 years we'll get a new administration if we have the opportunity to do that. I think they're trying to salt the earth so that we can't just go back to normal after that. I don't know if they'll be successful, but I think that is what they're trying to do. I think they're trying to blow up all of these systems. And so my reaction has been well, I've put in all of this work to get trained, and especially, so I've been doing work in misinformation, and I kind of shifted after 2016. I was like, I'm going to fight fascism with science, which first of all means I can't really portray my work as nonpartisan, which is kind of, that feels like a very naive choice right now, I guess. But in any case, I feel like, my work has been funded by Facebook. They're not funding this stuff anymore. Obviously, there were two really cool pieces of work that I saw here. Both of them had their funding canceled, and they got the data collected before their grants were canceled. I know, Lisa, I know you had a grant that was canceled on misinformation. And so clearly there's no federal funding for that. So I just feel like going to Europe is the only way to study this stuff, and I think they do care about it over there. It was kind of disappointing to hear. I knew that I thought they were stepping up a little bit with their funding. It's kind of disappointing to hear that they don't want to pick up that slack. If anything, I feel like the example of the U.S. during and after World War II, how did the U.S. become the World Center for Science was because of what we did getting the Germany was the leader in science before World War II. I assume a lot of people in this room know that. And then they were not anymore, and America became the leader. And I feel like it would be an opportunity for Europe to step up and be like, hey, we're going to take back that leadership role. And I haven't seen as strongly that it's not happening, but I also haven't seen that strongly that it is. And so how do we advocate for that if we feel like it might be hopeless in America?
So I think one of the issues is, as Seth mentioned, this rise of populism that's happening not just in the US, but it's happening in other countries as well. And so that rise tends to be anti-elite, anti-science, anti-university, and so that's part of the reason that we haven't seen the EU step up in the same way. The other thing is, like, the amazing US science infrastructure that we have was built up over time. It wasn't an immediate change. And so even if Europe decides, oh, we want to go that route, it's going to be decades before they're able to ramp up to that point, and it requires champions to push for it. I do think some of our colleagues overseas are doing great jobs trying to get other countries to step up and fighting for it, and it probably would be better for the world if all of our science power wasn't concentrated in just a few countries. So I'm hopeful that that might change, but I think given the situation we're in right now, there's such a big difference that it'll take a while before anything balances. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Mohan Gupta. I'm a postdoc at Princeton University, and thank you, panel. You guys, I think, had some very insightful things to say. And also, Lisa, I saw you talk recently there at Princeton, and you gave a really great talk.
Thank you.
And so I think this is not the first time I've heard that science communication can act as a protective factor for science funding. And one of the things that you guys have advocated for is just increasing the throughput. And so there's a limited number of professors, but there's an even greater number of trainees like me or other graduate students. And so I was wondering, what are the incentives or like carrots or sticks that could be implemented to get people like me to communicate science? Because I've completely stopped it because there's no incentive for me to do that kind of thing anymore.
I was actually thinking about that with the question from the employee at IBM, because this idea about like storytelling your science, I have heard that before, but I've not seen like an easy in. Like, I would describe Science Homecoming as the Mad Libs of science communication. Like, we try to make it like as painless as possible. And any science outreach or advocacy that's going to be widespread, that's going to be involve a lot of people, which not everything does need to, right? You can have a few key people. Will need to basically be like that, because we all have day jobs, right? And I don't get any professional points, basically, back in my university for this work. And it's not seen, I mean, it's not rewarded, and we don't have time to try to change that. And so what we need to do is, if there's something that needs a lot of people, we need to just make it really, really easy. And both easy in terms of the cognitive effort and in terms of the time.
So I agree that it's not easy to change that, but I think that it's a perennial problem. It's been, I've been coming for 20 years to this conference more, and we talk about some version of this every time. The incentive structure is built by people in this room. I write letters for people, they write letters for me, I sit on job searches. We have decided as a field what we value, and then we reify those values in every decision that we make. And so we should look at ourselves. It's not an external factor. We should look at ourselves, and if we want to value science communication, we have to build it into our systems, and we have to decide as a community that that is going to be something that we want to give points to, and that it isn't part of, it's not that the separation that Sarah's describing, which is real, that you have a day job and then you have this other stuff. We have to figure out how to break that down so that this counts as what we expect scientists to do, and we have the power to do that ourselves.
But I feel like that's, not to disagree, but I feel like that's our job during the next administration. Like, right now we're in like crisis mode. I'm not going to be able to like change the faculty handbook on tenure and promotion during that time.
No, but let me talk about two things that Vanderbilt did that I think are helpful and can be done in short time periods. So the first is, so many of you know I do a fair amount of science communication. During my pre-tenure review, my colleagues put in my letter we see that Lisa is doing this, and this is a valued part of her job as an academic. So it was in my counseling letter during pre-tenure review, she's doing this and we think it's important. And I think that was a useful signal and a useful tool for then when I went up for tenure, they couldn't turn around and then punish me for the thing that they had encouraged me to do. So that was one thing. Another is universities can support training in science communication. So at one point, Vanderbilt had a program where they would take faculty and you would get a course release and instead spend an entire semester working with the media relations people on media training, how to give interviews, how to write op-eds, practicing getting videotaped, watching yourself back, all of that stuff. And it was incentivized because you got a course release to do it. And so it's figuring out how do we work it into the incentive structures that already exist so that we can push it forward. And some of these, yes, are things we can do now, and others are kind of long-term, what can we do to protect ourselves in the future?
I'd love to add to that many departments of psychology are blowing up their tenure review and promotion to give credit for the valuable work. I mean, and I'll brag on Michael Doherty at University of Maryland and the Council of Graduate Departments of Psychology. They've been talking about this a lot. They're like, oh, we say we value all these things, and yet we reward none of them. You know what I mean? And so they are doing that, and there is some like top-down and bottom-up that goes on, but I think if you're a trainee who's interested in that, when it comes to looking for positions and stuff, ask those questions, like, do you consider this, I mean, and not just service, but reward in terms of the tenure review and promotion. So I think there is some good movement, and the National Academies is doing a lot of discussion about this too. And it was time to sort of ask, what do we reward and incentivize versus what do we say we value, whether it's open practices or supporting diverse perspective, you know, whatever the things are. So I think there is some, there's some good activity in that area.
Hi, I'm Lucy Butler. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Northeastern University. I was funded under an NIH grant that was terminated because I study misinformation. And I'm also here on a visa, which adds another layer of, I guess, I really empathized and felt the fear that you guys were talking about. And I guess, like, I felt that you gave really good, productive advice for what we can do and how we can really like push the importance of what we do. But I feel like as psychologists, we also acknowledge that fear is something that isn't great for productivity. And a lot of the recommendations add additional things to our workload that, as you've just talked about, aren't often recognized as much as maybe publishing, and also, you know, applying for grants where now there's a far larger number of pool, applying for a far smaller amount of resources. And I was just wondering, sort of a two-part question with, do you have any practical advice for early career researchers on where to best allocate our resources? And are you yourselves changing the way that you are evaluating people that you are looking at hiring due to these factors? And do you think that's something that as a field we should be talking about and thinking about more?
So I think you should allocate resources to taking care of yourself first, because I think operating under a condition of fear and anxiety. So I, as a Rice employee living in DC, there are people at OMB who have described putting federal employees in trauma, and it turns out that knowing that that's what people are trying to do to you doesn't protect you from feeling that. And so you have to do the things that you need to do to take care of yourself. And then I do think that we as a field have to think about how we, what we value. And I think we have to think about it not just in tenure and promotion, but we have to think about it in hiring, because I think the worst thing to do when we have a smaller pool of grant money is to make each grant feel much more valuable, and therefore it's like the especially good thing to have gotten, and it shows that you're the super special scientist, because that's going to create an unbelievably unfair environment that is going to be discriminatory in all sorts of ways that we know that these evaluative processes tend to be. And so, so yes, I am not, I mean, when I return to my institution and am back in a position to make those decisions, I'm planning to bring up a lot about how do we decide what we're looking for when we're hiring people, and things like that.
I have some more personal advice, which is that to the extent that you can, if you want to do advocacy, if you want to do some science communication, if you can turn that into a social thing for you, then instead of feeling like work, maybe it'll feel more like fun. And so that then doesn't draw from the same, energy resource. So my two Science Homecoming colleagues, Jess and Steve, are two of my best friends, right? And so doing this together feels fun. When I go to a rally with the other neuroscientists, that feels fun, whereas when I go alone, it feels not fun. And so I think that if you can shift to be doing this in a group, you will feel that it is less burdensome, but that doesn't mean that it's possible for everyone.
Yeah, and I think we're going to have to close in a second, but that leads nicely into my invitation for each of you to join us at the Diversity and Inclusion reception later. Well, we will have a postcard party where you can write your representative and either thank them for the work that they're doing to protect science or encourage them to do more to do that.
I just want to, tomorrow there's a NSF panel. It's described as if it's like how to get an NSF grant. The NSF employees, not we, I'm a Rice employee, people did not get permission to come, but we have recently, people who have recently left the NSF who have been program officers who are much more free to say all the things that they want to say about how the NSF works at this moment. And so I think it might be an interesting way to continue at least part of this conversation by going to the lunch meeting tomorrow.
And can I just say, I do think a lot of the division that we're seeing is by design. And so we do need to hold together as a community and sort of look around and figure out who we can support, how we can get through it. I mean, I just sort of think humanity is what's going to get us through this. And I will say, when you asked about hope, I feel like being at the conference gives me hope, right? It's people supporting each other, people doing great science. So maybe, just sort of a reminder to ourselves and just to reinforce the idea of finding your community and doing what you can to support others who might not be in as safe a position.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. Thanks again to our panelists. And we'll keep these conversations going.